Lake Erie takes a hit. Cigarette smokers take a hit, but the middle class might come out ahead. There's two budgets in the conversation today, and we'll be talking about both of them on The Opinion Show. We get together with members of the editorial board of the Plain Dealer and the Northeast Iowa Media Group. I'm here with Opinion Director Betsy Sullivan, Deputy Editorial Page Editor Kevin O'Brien, also popular columnist, and editorial writers Sharon Broussard and Peter Krouse. Let's start with the state budget that John Kasich unveiled. The biggest theme I think we see is a big shifting of the tax burden. You could argue it's moving to more regressive taxes as you move away from income taxes to more on sales taxes. Also looks to get some revenue out of cigarette smokers and the people that are drilling for the fuel underneath Ohio. So Kevin, what do you think about that tax shell game, as you just called it?
Well, I think it's a big salute to small businesses. One of the things that he's trying to do is, by even in the business tax side, he's trying to shift taxes toward the larger businesses and actually even exempt small businesses from a lot of taxes. They're messing with the commercial activities tax for the first time since it was established.
Boosting it a little bit.
Yep, and it is a little bit. It's not a tremendous amount, but again, small businesses get a big break because the minimum payment that a business would have to make goes way down. So there's that. The regressive side, they're trying to shift from income taxes to sales taxes for a lot of the state revenue, with a 0.5% sales tax increase across the board, which would make Cuyahoga County would still be the highest taxed county in the state, but it would be up to 9%, I think, now for Cuyahoga County goods and services that are taxed. And speaking of services, adding some services to the state sales tax rolls that hadn't been on there before.
But it looks like newspapers are still exempt from that, as far as we can see.
As well they should be.
The governor has been, since before he became governor, has talked about wanting to get rid of the income tax in Ohio. He's whittled away at it. We're nowhere close to being rid of it. But this is another significant cut. And does this really have something to do with his aspirations beyond being governor?
Well, it's not going to hurt him, certainly, if he wants to build a national platform on budgeting and tax cutting. Budgeting is the thing he was known for in Washington. Now, if he's a tax cutter who can also budget, I'm sure he looks at that as advantage.
Betsy, in the editorial today, we took a hard position on this shifting of the taxes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we do see that it continues this tax inequity. Now, I mean, you have to credit that the governor, when he proposes income tax cuts, he's looking for other revenues to replace it. What seems to be happening with his budgets is when it gets to the Republican-controlled legislature, they gladly accept the income tax cuts, but they don't accept the revenue enhancements that he's proposing. So they didn't accept the tobacco taxes, and he came back with a much bolder, bigger amount this time. They didn't accept, the severance taxes to the extent that he proposed them. He's still, pounding on that. And there are other examples. But yeah, even though it is very laudable that he is looking out for the little guy, in the end, to shift from income tax as a primary revenue generator for Ohio to sales tax is a very regressive move, and it doesn't take into account what's happening at the local level, where local taxes are really going up also in a kind of regressive mode in that sense as well. So so we were critical.
And in the local area, we saw some pretty dramatic changes in what he wants to do with schools, both with charter schools and with the school funding. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. In terms of school funding, it's interesting to see that he's going back to an idea that he had a number of years ago, which is that schools that can reap less money from their taxpayers would get more money. So Cleveland is looking good, but then the other schools that have more affluent taxpayers would get less. And if I remember correctly, we had a whole spate of stories from various suburban school districts, complaining that would mean that they would then have to turn around and go to voters once again and ask them for more money, and that actually, they're not, so super wealthy that they could just exist with less state funds. So that was very interesting, and I suspect if they get the same kind of pushback, that's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I remember 4 years ago, that was the huge thing. When you looked at the districts like the Solons and the Oranges, they were taking a hit, but in the final analysis, they had restored a lot of that, but he's going to that well.
He's
again.
going to that well again. And then it's interesting to see a shift on charter school reform. You know, for a long time, he and a number of the other Republicans could see no wrong in charter schools, and all of a sudden, you know, the story is different. I want to credit Ohio Auditor Dave Yost, who's turned out many reports taking a look at the management of those places, and most lately about their attendance and how he did some spot checks, and you know, there weren't kids, there weren't bodies in the seats there the way there should have been. So it's interesting to see that he's now going to crack down on sponsors, which has long been kind of the weak spot here. These are people who are supposed to oversee the schools. Unfortunately, many of them kind of take the 3%, you know, revenue that they can receive, and then they, you know, I don't know where they go, but they don't tend to, you know, really watch their schools. So he's cracking down on those, and I thought he had a lot of good ideas there, but not enough good ideas on transparency to make sure that charter school finances are clear and open, all the books are open, and that in addition that, you know, everything that's put into a charter school belongs to, you know, the state, but not to these for-profit management companies.
Pete, you've been a strong proponent of the need to build jobs in Ohio, and part of the reason for the change in the tax structure with the small businesses is an argument that it'll help create jobs, although the critics say that the savings from the small businesses don't come anywhere close to the money needed to create jobs. How does that kind of play into your thoughts about the need for jobs?
Well, I don't know how much tax policy and the tax code really affects job creation. It depends on who you talk to. You know, if you're anti-tax, then you're always going to say that, you know, Ohio is one of the most least friendly states to businesses because of its tax code. But then other people will look at it a different way, and they'll say something just the opposite. I don't necessarily have a problem with him cutting taxes on small businesses if it's truly designed for small businesses and not wealthy folks who somehow can qualify as a small business because of maybe the way they invest their money. I don't know the specifics of that. But I don't really have a problem with that. I think shifting the burden towards larger corporations it may make sense. It could, on the margins, have an effect. The one thing, though, about the tax reforms that don't make a whole lot of sense to me, and that Kevin and Betsy already touched on, is the transfer to the sales tax. That could potentially hurt the economy a little bit if it reduces consumption. For some reason, John Kasich wants to make Ohio Florida, where the income taxes are low and the sales taxes are high. Well, we're not a tourism state, so that doesn't come into play. And he thinks that the reason a lot of people, wealthy people, leave Ohio for Florida is because they are taxed here. And I don't think that's the reason. I think it has to do with the 18 inches of snow outside the building right now.
And yet you would object to making Ohio Florida with 18 inches of snow?
I love the snow. I'm a snow person.
Let's talk too about Medicaid. You know, John Kasich has felt strongly that we need to continue that program. The budget makes that possible. He might still run into some resistance with the legislature. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I think one of the things, there are things in the Medicaid portion of what he's proposed that they look to me at least like they're sort of reeling in the people who would say, well, you know, we shouldn't have expanded it. You know, he wants to make it possible to charge a premium to people who, during their time in the program, actually get their income above 100% of the federal poverty level. There's something else too in there that was, I can't remember now what it was, but there's some other restriction that's new that you know, could make it a little more palatable to the conservatives. I still think they never should have expanded it in the first place because I don't like the cooperation in the Obamacare takeover. But, you know, they've done what they've done. Now he's trying to sell it to legislators. It's Maxwell Smart, you know. Would you believe whatever, you know? So he's throwing them a bone and seeing if they'll go along this time rather than having to make them go through the controlling board.
But, you know, most of the experts who've looked at this have said that, you know, Medicaid expansion has been a huge benefit for Ohio financially, and for
Your experts are on the left, yes, they'll say that.
I mean, you know, even if you take sort of middle of the roaders, those who simply look at the finances. I mean, we had the head of the prison system in here, and he was talking about how Medicaid expansion has actually enabled him, in cooperation with civilian health authorities, to really start getting a handle on both mental health and drug addiction problems within the prison system and those who leave it, because it suddenly allows there to be continuity of care where there was never that opportunity before. So no, I think that there are very strong reasons for it, and one of the reasons they need a little bit more flexibility and they need some of these co-pays is because the number of Ohioans who have stepped forward and have been, in fact, eligible for Medicaid has been so much beyond expectations.
This does fit into, John Kasich is somebody that's pretty far on the right, but he's that kind of rare person on the right that is pushing to expand programs like this because he believes in the long run it will get people out of poverty. And part of his push so far, I mean, he's got a welfare reform program that does some of the same things that will push people along to get them out, but while increasing the help they get while they're in. So that kind of marries up with that policy.
Which means he's not actually pretty far on the right.
Well,
he's a moderate.
Under the Clinton administration, he had tremendous success in getting people off of welfare, and so I mean, it can be done
with a huge kick in the pants from Newt Gingrich. Yes.
Okay. Fair enough.
All right, we've spent most of this time talking about the state budget, which is concrete and has elements that likely will pass. We should talk a little bit about the federal budget, which is much bigger and really has no chance of passing. And the thing that really stuck out to me when that was introduced was the reduction of money being set aside for Lake Erie. We just came through a year where a major city didn't have drinking water for 3 days. You would think that kind of a crisis would bring additional spending, but it's been cut. What are we thinking the reason for that is?
Well, if I could, say, I'm wondering where the president's there is, because this Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is his proposal. He comes from Chicago, and he really believes in the health of the Great Lakes as an economic driver, as an essential resource to be preserved, and yet, when he produces a budget that to me is simply a political document instead of, as you say, the starting point of the budget discussion, he cuts it, and he's been trying to cut it, and the legislature on a bipartisan basis stands up to him, and I think that there's an expectation that money will be restored. But it does tell you something that if you look at the documents the White House put out, they're purporting that this budget he produced is not going to worsen the deficit. But in fact, that's even a little bit of accounting sleight of hand, because they're simply saying it's not going to be a bigger hit on the GDP than the last budget, which was sort of pressing the envelope, and our long-term deficit continues. So, to me, this is just a numbers game.
Kevin, the president had a chance with the full Republican control of the House and the Senate to introduce a budget that is a sign that he wants to negotiate and to work with them to do reforms. But this budget doesn't seem to have that at all. It was, I think most people who looked at it thought, okay, well we won't even start here. What do you think?
Right, I think he said, here's a budget, now stick it up your nose. And he knows it's not going anywhere. Did he use that language? Probably. Yeah. Well, I mean, something
Stronger.
Akin to that. It's not going anywhere. He knew it wasn't going anywhere. As Betsy said, he could have named he could have said $800 million for Great Lakes restoration and say, made a bold statement of some sort, and he sort of did that on the sequester stuff. He wants to get rid of all of that. The only thing that he has been able to actually cite as he could have cited if he was being honest about the cutting the current budget deficit. That's what did it. Yeah. He's trumpeting that. He had nothing to do with it. He resisted it, with every fiber of his being. Actually, I'll go even broader here. I think it's actually sort of offensive when any president sends a budget to Congress. It is not the president's job. Congress is where the budget is supposed to be decided, and then they send it to the president for signature or veto.
Which is what's going to happen.
Well, yeah, eventually we get to that, but, you know, presidents for as long as I've been alive have been sending, but, you know, just knock it off. Let Congress do their job.
But this is kind of what, his wish list, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is.
Putting down your markers and
And that's
saying,
fine.
these are the
That's
things I
part of
want
the
to do.
political document,
Yeah,
and
no
so
matter
here are things
what
I'd really love to see guys have.
And he's even establishing, I think, some potential negotiating positions in doing so, especially with some of the tax code reforms, although I still don't think they're going to initiate anything. But it is kind of mystifying, some of the things, the Great Lakes, and also the infrastructure plan that he calls for, almost $500 billion in infrastructure projects over 6 years, yet the way he wants to finance it largely is through taxing foreign profits. And that's not going anywhere, so.
That's probably not even legal. I mean, the money wasn't made in the United States. It has never touched these shores. I don't know how he can justify legally going after it.
Well, and what's interesting is, you know, if the money's repatriated, it is taxed at the current rate of 35%, unless you can figure out some loophole to get it lower. And what he's proposing is a 14% tax on all the accumulated profits, whether or not they're repatriated. So even if they stayed overseas, they would still be taxed. And then there would be a 19% going forward. I like the idea of maybe a one-time only lower tax on repatriated profits. In fact, some Republicans even proposed that last year, but it's not going to go anywhere.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. Two budgets, we'll have plenty more coverage of those on cleveland.com, and we'll look for your thoughts on each of those as we continue to cover this process. See you next